Hey guys, tonight we begin with something equal parts thrilling and horrifying. Your high school prom, except it is 1958. Your dress weighs more than you do, and your date just doused himself in his father's entire bottle of aftershave. Forget the neon-lit, limousine-rented, DJ-blasting proms of today. Tonight, we are talking about the original. Crepe paper, curfews, and a chaperone named Mrs. Dinkle, who can smell a slow dance from clear across the gymnasium. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a heartfelt thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. Your ideas really do shape everything I make, and I could not do any of this without you. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Somehow it is always 2 a.m. somewhere, and if you would rather drift off with just your ears, the channel is now on Spotify as well, with the link waiting in the description. And if you'd like a little more, membership is already available on the channel, which gives you access to 8 hours of ad-free video to drift off to uninterrupted whenever you like. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, get comfortable, and maybe practice your box step because you are going to need it. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what prom was actually like back then? Was the punch really spiked, or was that just a rumour started by somebody's older brother? Did people honestly leave room for the Holy Ghost while dancing? How did anyone survive a whole evening strapped into a girdle made of industrial rubber? Could you afford a corsage on a paper route salary? And would you last one night under the hawk-eyed gaze of 3 teachers, a gym coach, and the entire Parent-Teacher Association? And now, congratulations. You have just woken up on the morning of your prom. The year is 1958. Your hair is pinned into curlers the size of soup cans. Your mother is already crying, and the most important night of your teenage life is roughly 12 hours away. Good luck. Let's start where every great disaster begins, the morning of. You wake up not to a gentle alarm, but to the sound of your mother already in a state of low-grade panic somewhere down the hall. Your head feels strange, and that is because you slept in a full set of curlers, pinned so tightly that you now wear a permanent expression of mild surprise. Breakfast is a nervous affair, assuming you can eat at all, because tonight is the night. Prom, the event you have been dreaming about, dreading, and saving for since roughly the beginning of time. You have about 12 hours to transform yourself from an ordinary teenager into something resembling a movie star, and the clock is already laughing at you. The curlers. Let's dwell on the curlers for a moment. You slept in them, if sleep is even the right word for lying rigid on your back all night trying not to move, terrified of crushing a single one. They are enormous, hard and unforgiving, and they have left deep grooves in your scalp that you can feel with your fingertips. Every time you rolled over in the night, one of them jabbed you behind the ear like a tiny plastic act of revenge. It is the 1950s equivalent of trying to sleep wearing a helmet made of hair rollers, which is to say, exactly that. Downstairs, the household has already descended into a special kind of chaos. Your mother is somehow both crying and issuing orders, a talent unique to mothers on important days. There is a list. There is always a list, and it is long, and it is written in her handwriting, which grows more frantic toward the bottom. Pick up the dress. Confirm the flowers. Polish the shoes. Do not, under any circumstances, eat anything that might stain. You nod along, sipping weak coffee you're too anxious to taste, while your younger siblings orbit the kitchen looking for opportunities to make everything worse. Time behaves strangely on prom morning. For the first few hours it crawls, and you find yourself with nothing to do but stare at the clock and imagine every possible catastrophe. Then, without warning, it lurches forward, and suddenly it is early afternoon and you have accomplished absolutely nothing except worrying. This is the great cruelty of anticipation. It is like waiting for a pot to boil, except the pot is your entire social future, and the stove is powered by pure adrenaline. There are errands, and the errands feel monumental. A trip to collect the dress becomes a solemn procession. A stop for a forgotten pair of stockings takes on the weight of a diplomatic mission. Every red light is a personal insult. Every slow-moving shopper in the aisle ahead of you is an enemy of the state. You're operating on nerves and sugar, and the day has barely begun. And through all of it hums the single terrifying thought, what if something goes wrong? What if the curls fall flat? The dress does not zip, the boy does not show. The whole shimmering evening collapses into humiliation. You have poured months of hope into this one night, and now it sits just over the horizon, glittering and impossibly far away. So you breathe, you check the list again, and you submit yourself to the process. Because there is no turning back now. The machinery of prom has been set in motion, powered by your mother's tears and a truly heroic quantity of hairspray, and it will not stop until you are standing in that gymnasium, ready or not. Before any of this could happen, someone had to do the truly terrifying part, the asking. There was no sliding into anyone's messages, no clever group chat, no letting an app do the heavy lifting. If you were a boy, you had to walk up to another living human being, in person, with your actual voice, and ask them to prom while your palms sweated straight through your good shirt. If you were a girl, you had to wait, and waiting was its own special torture, hovering near a telephone bolted to the kitchen wall and shared with your entire family. One wrong move, one misread signal, one rival who asked first, and your whole prom season could collapse before it even began. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of the boy, because his ordeal is the more visibly agonizing of the two. There is a girl. You have decided, after weeks of internal debate conducted entirely inside your own skull, that she is the one you will ask. Now all you have to do is form words in her presence, a skill you have apparently forgotten how to perform. You rehearse the line in the mirror. You rehearse it walking to school. You rehearse it so many times it stops sounding like language and starts sounding like a foreign chant. Then comes the moment. She's at her locker, or by the water fountain, or laughing with her friends, which is the worst possible scenario because now there is an audience. Your heart is doing something medically alarming. Your mouth is dry as the surface of the moon. You open it to speak, and what comes out is a strangled noise, followed by the smoothest sentence a nervous teenage boy has ever assembled, which is to say, not smooth at all. Somewhere in the mumbling, the word prom appears. You have done it. Now you wait for the verdict. And the waiting, oh the waiting. It lasts perhaps 2 seconds and feels like a geological era. In that gap you experience every possible outcome, most of them catastrophic. You imagine her laughing. You imagine her friends laughing. You imagine having to change schools or possibly countries. It is like sending a message and watching those 3 little dots appear and disappear, except the dots are a real human face and there is no phone to hide behind. For the girl, the torment is quieter but no less real. You cannot ask, or at least you're not supposed to, so you must engineer situations in which you might be asked. You linger. You smile encouragingly at the boy you hope will find his nerve. You drop hints so subtle they border on invisible, then agonize over whether they were too subtle. And always there is the telephone, that great communal device chained to the kitchen wall, where any incoming call must be conducted within earshot of your mother pretending not to listen, while doing dishes very, very slowly. The rejection, when it happened in person with nowhere to run. There was no soft blue screen to absorb the blow, no ability to simply not respond and let the matter quietly die. You stood there, in the hallway, and you took it on the chin, and then you had to keep attending school with that person for the rest of the year. So yes, landing a date required genuine courage, the kind that makes your voice shake. And when someone finally said yes, the relief was so total, so overwhelming, that you nearly forgot the part where you now had to actually go through with the entire evening. To understand prom, you first have to understand the sacred and slightly ridiculous world of going steady. This was the 1950s, and teenage romance came with more rules than a game of chess. Going steady meant you were a couple, officially, and there were symbols to prove it. His class ring worn on a chain around your neck, or his Letterman jacket draped over your shoulders like a woolen flag of ownership. It was serious business, monitored closely by friends, parents, and the tireless school rumour mill. Break up the week before prom, and you were not merely heartbroken, you were logistically doomed. Let's examine the class ring situation, because it was a whole ceremony unto itself. A boy's class ring was a chunky, official-looking object, and handing it over to a girl was a declaration heard round the entire school. She could not simply wear it on her finger, of course, because it was roughly the size of a doorknob and would slide right off. So she wound yarn or tape around the band until it fit, or she strung it on a chain and wore it around her neck, where it sat against her sweater, announcing to the world that she was spoken for. It was the 1950s equivalent of changing your relationship status, except the whole town could see it and nobody could unfollow. Then there was the Letterman jacket, that heavy wool coat with leather sleeves earned through athletic glory. When a boy gave his jacket to a girl, it was practically a betrothal. She wore it everywhere, comically oversized, sleeves swallowing her hands, and she wore it with pride, because it meant she belonged to someone worth belonging to. It was a bit like being handed a giant fuzzy trophy that also kept you warm. Rival girls noted it with envy. Younger girls noted it with aspiration. Everyone noted it. But going steady was not merely about accessories. It came with an elaborate code of expectations, most of them unwritten yet somehow universally understood. You sat together at lunch. You were seen together at the movies and the malt shop. He walked you to class. You did not so much as glance at another potential suitor without triggering a scandal that would ripple through the hallways by the end of the day. The school rumour mill ran 24 hours a day on a fuel made entirely of teenage speculation, and it never, ever slept. Parents watched this whole affair with a mixture of amusement and alarm. Going steady was tolerated mostly, but it was also viewed as a slippery slope toward getting far too serious far too young. Fathers were known to develop sudden, pointed interest in exactly how steady this steadiness was. Mothers offered guidance disguised as gentle interrogation. The relationship was, in a sense, a family project with an unusually large number of stakeholders, and the stakes around prom time were sky high. If you were going steady, your prom date was gloriously settled, a done deal, one less thing to fear. But heaven help the couple who suffered a falling out in those final crucial weeks. A breakup in April was a tragedy. A breakup the week before, prom was a full-blown catastrophe that left both parties dateless, humiliated and scrambling, while the rumour mill worked itself into an absolute frenzy of delight. So going steady was both a comfort and a gamble. It offered security, status, and a guaranteed dance partner. It also meant your entire romantic life was conducted under the watchful eyes of everyone you knew, wrapped in wool and strung on a chain for all the world to judge. Let's talk about the dress, because for a 1950s girl this was less a garment and more a life event. Picture yards upon yards of tulle, taffeta and pastel-coloured dreams, all assembled into something that made you look like an elegant walking marshmallow. The silhouette was everything, a waist cinched to impossible proportions, followed by an explosion of skirt so wide you could barely fit through a doorway. Some dresses were bought after months of saving. Others were sewn at home by a mother hunched over a sewing machine at midnight, muttering things no child should overhear. Either way, by the time you zipped it up, you were committed, both financially and structurally. The colours of the era were soft and dreamy, all pale pinks, powder blues, mint greens and buttery yellows, the shades of a well-stocked candy shop. The fabrics were chosen for their ability to hold a shape and catch the light. Taffeta that rustled with every step, tulle that floated and bounced, satin that gleamed under the gymnasium lights. When you moved, you announced yourself with a symphony of soft swishing, like a very glamorous curtain being drawn across a stage. For many families, buying the dress was simply out of the question, which is where the home-sewn masterpiece entered the picture. Your mother, or perhaps an aunt with a reputation for such things, would acquire a pattern and a bolt of fabric and set to work at the kitchen table. This was not a casual undertaking. It involved pins held in mouths, measurements taken and retaken, and long evenings of a sewing machine whirring late into the night. There were fittings, during which you stood perfectly still on a chair while being circled and prodded and told to stop slouching. There were setbacks, and during those setbacks you learned several new words. The fit was the whole point, and the fit was brutal. The bodice hugged tight, the waist pulled into a circumference that seemed to defy human anatomy, and the whole structure depended on you not eating very much and not breathing very deeply. Trying it on for the first time was a moment of truth. Would it zip? The zipper, that small metal judge of your evening, ran up the back, and getting it closed often required a second person, some determined tugging, and a shared moment of triumph when it finally reached the top. Once you were in it, you were in it. Sitting became a delicate negotiation. You could not simply flop into a chair like a normal person. You had to lower yourself with the care of someone parking a very wide vehicle, arranging the skirt around you in great billowing waves. Doorways became obstacles requiring strategy. Car doors became genuine adversaries, a battle we will return to in painful detail later. The dress did not simply clothe you, it governed you, and yet, despite all of it, despite the cost, the cinching, the sewing machine tantrums, and the near-total loss of mobility, there was that one moment. You stood in front of the mirror, fully assembled, and you saw not a marshmallow but a vision, something out of a magazine, something out of a movie. The transformation was real, and for that instant it was worth every saved-up dollar and every muttered curse over the sewing machine. So you took one last look, squared your shoulders as much as the bodice would allow, and prepared to face the night. Just as soon as you figured out how to walk down the stairs in it, without toppling over like a felled tree. Now, that magnificent skirt did not achieve its glorious dome shape all on its own. Underneath was a feat of engineering that would impress a bridge builder. The petticoat, or if you were truly ambitious, several petticoats layered like a cake. These were stiff nets of crinoline, sometimes starched into submission, sometimes dipped in a sugar water solution to make them hold their shape, which, yes, occasionally attracted insects. Sitting down became a strategic operation. Getting into a car was a full wrestling match. And if you leaned the wrong way, the whole contraption could flip up and reveal everything you had spent the evening trying to hide. Let's appreciate the ambition of the layered petticoat, because more was always considered better. One petticoat gave you a nice fullness. 2 gave you a proper bell. 3 or more, and you achieved the coveted silhouette of a girl who appeared to be emerging from the centre of a large flower. The trade-off, naturally, was that you now occupied roughly the same square footage as a small automobile, and you had to plan your movements through the world accordingly. The stiffening process was where things got truly inventive. Crinoline could be starched until it held its shape like armour, but the real trick, passed down in whispers among the desperate and the fashionable, was the sugar water dip. You soaked the petticoat, let it dry, and behold, It stood on its own like a tent. The problem, and it was a considerable problem, was that a garment coated in dried sugar is deeply attractive to insects. So you achieved a spectacular skirt at the small risk of ants deciding your undergarments were a picnic. Fashion, as they say, demands sacrifice. Sitting down in this apparatus required forethought and a bit of physics. You could not simply sit. You had to guide the skirt and its scaffolding into position, compressing the whole crinkling mass beneath and around you while it fought back with a life of its own. Sit too casually and the petticoats would rebel, springing upward in front of your face like a stiff net curtain caught in a gust. There was a technique to it, a graceful lowering and arranging motion, and mastering it separated the poised young ladies from the ones wrestling their own clothing in the middle of the dance floor. The car, though, the car was the true battlefield, and we'll suffer through that ordeal in full later, but know this: fitting yourself, your dress, and your multiple petticoats into a 1950s automobile was less like getting into a vehicle, and more like stuffing an enormous cloud through a mail slot. It took teamwork, it took patience, it occasionally took a boy standing helplessly by while you shoved yards of netting into the footwell. And then there was the ever-present danger of the flip. The stiffer the petticoat, the more it wanted to spring upward at the slightest provocation. A sudden turn, an ill-advised lean, a strong breeze near an open door, and the whole front of your carefully constructed dome could flip skyward, exposing the petticoats, the stockings, and the general architecture you had worked so hard to keep private. Chaperones lived in fear of it. So did you. It was the wardrobe malfunction of its day, and it lurked around every corner. So beneath the beautiful dress lay a hidden world of stiff netting, sugar, insects, and constant low-level peril. The skirt that looked so effortless and dreamy from the outside was in fact held aloft by sheer engineering and willpower. You floated across the room like a dream, and only you knew that beneath the surface it was all strut, starch, and the quiet fear of an ant colony taking up residence. It's time for the beauty parlour, a place of magic, gossip, and industrial-strength chemicals. If your family could spare the money, you made a pilgrimage to sit in a vinyl chair while a woman named something like Dolores went to work on your head. Here you were subjected to the hairdryer of the era, an enormous dome that lowered over your skull like a spaceship and roasted you at temperatures usually reserved for baking bread. You emerged an hour later with a hairstyle so rigid it could deflect a baseball, locked in place by a cloud of hairspray thick enough to qualify as its own weather system. You were not allowed to touch it. You were barely allowed to breathe near it. The beauty parlour was a world unto itself, a warm, humid cavern that smelled of setting lotion, permanent wave solution, and roughly 40 years of accumulated gossip. The moment you walked in, you were enveloped in it, this heady chemical fog that stung your eyes a little and announced that serious beauty work was underway. Rows of women sat in various stages of transformation, some under dryers, some in curlers, all of them talking, because the beauty parlour was as much a social institution as a cosmetic one. Dolores, or whatever her name was, greeted you like a general receiving a new recruit. She sat you in the chair, draped you in a cape, and assessed your head with the critical eye of an artist facing a difficult canvas. Then the work began. There was washing, there was setting, there was the careful winding of your hair around rollers, each one secured with a pin driven in with just enough force to remind you that beauty is not comfortable. You sat through all of it, trying to make conversation while your scalp slowly registered a series of small complaints. Then came the dryer, and the dryer deserves its own paragraph of respect and dread. It was an enormous hooded contraption that descended over your entire head, sealing you inside a roaring bubble of hot air. The temperature climbed steadily from pleasant to concerning to genuinely reminiscent of an oven. You sat there for what felt like an hour, because it was an hour, flipping through a magazine you could barely concentrate on, cooking gently, sweating in places you did not know could sweat, while your hair set itself into permanence. When you finally emerged from the dome, flushed and slightly dazed, the true artistry began. Dolores unwound the curlers, teased and brushed and shaped, building your hair up into a structure of remarkable height and rigidity. And then, the finishing touch, the coup de grace, the hairspray. She reached for a can and unleashed a mist so thick, so all-encompassing, that the very air turned cloudy and you learned to hold your breath on instinct. When the fog cleared, your hairstyle had achieved a state of near-geological permanence. You could not touch it. This was the ironclad rule, delivered with total seriousness. One careless swipe of the hand and you risked disturbing the delicate architecture that had taken an hour and considerable expense to construct. You held your head very still. You moved through the rest of the day like a woman balancing an invisible tray, terrified of wind, rain, low doorways, and any sudden movement. And so you walked out of the parlour transformed, your head a monument to mid-century glamour, sealed against the elements by a shellac of hairspray that would likely survive a mild explosion. It was uncomfortable, it was expensive, and it smelled faintly of chemicals for the rest of the evening. But it looked magnificent, and looking magnificent as you were rapidly learning was the entire point of the exercise. With the hair conquered, it was time to address the face, and 1950s beauty standards had opinions. The look was polished, precise, and just a touch dramatic. Powdered skin, carefully drawn brows, and lips painted a red so bold it practically had its own personality. Makeup was applied with the seriousness of a painter approaching a canvas, because a lady was supposed to look effortless while secretly spending a truly enormous amount of effort. Too little, and you looked plain. Too much, and you invited whispers from the chaperones and the local gossips. It was a tightrope walk performed in front of a bathroom mirror with your mother offering unsolicited commentary from the doorway. Let's start with the foundation, because the era prized a flawless, matte, porcelain complexion. You applied a base, then set it with powder, building toward a finish so smooth and even that your face appeared to have been lightly dusted with sugar. The goal was to erase every imperfection, every freckle, every sign that you were a living human with pores. It was a lot like plastering a wall. If the wall were your face, and the stakes were your entire social standing. Then came the eyebrows, which in the 1950s were serious, defined, and full of character. You shaped them, darkened them, and gave them a confident arch that conveyed poise and just a hint of drama. A well-drawn brow could frame the whole face. A poorly drawn one could give you a permanent expression of surprise or skepticism that you would then wear for the entire evening. There was no room for error, and yet the tools were essentially a pencil and a prayer. The eyes received careful attention but stayed relatively restrained. A soft sweep of shadow, perhaps a delicate line, and mascara applied in the days before it came in a convenient tube with a handy wand. Applying it was an exercise in patience and steady hands, and one sneeze at the wrong moment could undo minutes of concentrated effort and leave you looking like you had been crying, which, given the stress of the day, you might well have been. But the true centerpiece, the crown jewel of the 1950s face, was the lipstick, and not just any lipstick, but red, a bold, confident, unmissable red that arrived at the party a full 3 seconds before you did. You lined the lips, filled them in, blotted with a tissue, and reapplied, building a colour so saturated it seemed to glow. It was the punctuation mark at the end of the whole elaborate sentence of your face, and it did not whisper. It declared. The great paradox of it all was the demand for effortlessness. You were expected to look naturally radiant, as though you had simply woken up glamorous, while the reality involved a good hour of concentrated labour, a dressing table cluttered with tools, and a level of precision usually reserved for defusing bombs. A lady never let on how much work it took. She simply appeared, luminous and composed, and let everyone assume she'd been born that way. And presiding over the entire operation, of course, was your mother, stationed in the doorway offering a running commentary you had not requested. That's too much rouge. Blend that. In my day, we didn't cake it on like that. You absorbed the notes, made your adjustments, and pressed on, because the tightrope between plain and scandalous was narrow, and the whole neighbourhood was ready to judge which side you landed on. One final glance in the mirror, one last blot of the lips, and your face was ready to meet its public. Let's discuss the undergarment that nightmares are made of. The girdle. Beneath the dress, beneath the petticoats, wrapped around your midsection like a vengeful python, sat a garment designed to smooth, shape, and slowly suffocate. Made of heavy elastic and rubber, the girdle promised the fashionable silhouette of the era at the small cost of your ability to bend, sit, or fully inhale. Attached to it were garters gripping your stockings, because pantyhose had not yet arrived to save anyone. So there you stood, cinched and clamped into rubber armour, preparing to dance the night away while quietly wondering whether oxygen was really all that important. Getting into the thing was the first trial. A girdle did not go on so much as it was fought into position, wrestled up over the hips in a series of tugs, hops, and undignified manoeuvres that no one was ever permitted to witness. It gripped, it resisted, it rolled and pinched and had strong opinions about being worn. By the time you had it settled into place, you had broken a light sweat and possibly reconsidered several of your life choices, and the evening had not even begun. Once on, the girdle set immediately to its true purpose, which was to compress you into the smooth, curveless yet curvy silhouette the era demanded. It flattened, it shaped, it held everything exactly where fashion insisted it should be held. The effect from the outside was undeniably sleek. The effect from the inside was that of being gently but firmly embraced by an industrial rubber band that had no intention of letting go and did not much care how you felt about it. Sitting down introduced fresh challenges. The girdle didn't bend willingly, so folding yourself into a chair became a careful negotiation between your body and the garment's rigid convictions. It dug in at the hips, it pushed back against your ribs. And breathing, that thing you had previously taken entirely for granted, became a shallow, ladylike operation. Small sips of air taken at the surface because anything deeper simply was not on offer. You learned to survive on considerably less oxygen than you'd previously believed necessary. Then there were the garters, those little clips dangling from the bottom of the girdle, whose job was to grip the tops of your stockings and hold them up. This was the age before pantyhose, so stockings were separate items requiring anchoring, and the garter was the anchor. When it worked, it held everything in place with quiet efficiency. When it failed dramatically, releasing its grip mid-stride so that a stocking began a slow, humiliating descent down your leg while you searched frantically for a private corner in which to reattach it. The whole rubber and elastic contraption grew warmer as the night wore on, a cosy little microclimate all its own, sealed against the air and heating up with every dance. By the middle of the evening you had made peace with a permanent state of mild constriction, the way one makes peace with any long-term hardship, through resignation and the occasional deep sigh, or rather the occasional shallow one, since deep was off the table, and yet you wore it, because the silhouette demanded it, and the era decreed it, and every other girl in that gymnasium was suffering identically beneath her own beautiful dress. It was a shared, unspoken misery, a secret sisterhood of the barely breathing. So you stood tall, smoothed your skirt, and marched into your evening clamped into rubber armour, comforted only by the knowledge that everyone around you was quietly, elegantly suffocating right alongside you. Now for the finishing touches, the small accessories that separated a well-dressed young lady from a chaotic one. Gloves were often expected, delicate little things that reached past the wrist or even the elbow, worn to signal grace and good breeding. You carried a tiny clutch purse containing exactly the essentials: a lipstick for touch-ups, a handkerchief, and perhaps a few coins for emergencies. Everything had to match. Everything had to be just so. And all of this had to be managed while you could barely feel your fingers through satin gloves, and your feet were already staging a quiet rebellion inside brand new shoes. The gloves were a statement, a soft-spoken little emblem of refinement. Made of satin or fine cotton, they slid up your hands and forearms and transformed you instantly into someone who looked as though she attended formal events regularly and knew exactly which fork to use. They also rendered your hands about 60% less useful. Picking up a cup of punch became a careful operation. Handling a fork required concentration. Anything involving fine motor skills like retrieving a coin or fixing a stray hair became a small comedy performed for anyone watching. The clutch purse was a triumph of editing. It was tiny, barely large enough to hold a thought, and so you had to choose its contents with the ruthless precision of someone packing for expedition. A tube of lipstick, obviously, for the inevitable touch-ups after punch and conversation. A handkerchief, clean and pressed, for emergencies both practical and emotional. A few coins tucked away in case of some vaguely imagined crisis requiring exact change. That was it. That was all the world would allow you to carry, and so that was all you brought. The shoes deserve a moment of sympathy, because the shoes were often brand new, and brand new shoes are a special form of self-inflicted suffering. Dyed to match the dress, with a modest heel that felt entirely reasonable at the shoe store, and entirely unreasonable by the second hour of the evening. They looked lovely and felt like a slow-motion betrayal. You had perhaps worn them around the house once or twice to break them in, which accomplished nothing, and now they were preparing to introduce you to blisters in places you did not know could blister. The great commandment of the accessories was that everything had to match. The shoes matched the dress, the gloves complemented the shoes, the clutch coordinated with all of it. A lady presented as a single, harmonious composition, every element in agreement, nothing clashing, nothing out of place. Achieving this required planning, coordination, and often a fair amount of dye, as white shoes and bags were tinted to match a specific pastel shade in a process that was equal parts art and gamble. And so you stood, fully assembled at last, a vision of coordinated pastel perfection, from your rigid hairstyle down to your matching, faintly tortuous shoes. You were graceful. You were refined. You looked as though managing all of this were the most natural thing in the world. The reality, known only to you, was that you could barely feel your gloved fingers. Your feet had begun composing a formal letter of complaint. Your clutch held roughly 3 items, and you were still, let us not forget, encased in the rubber armour from the previous chapter. But none of that showed. You smiled, adjusted a glove, and prepared to glide into the evening, the very picture of effortless elegance, held together by coordination, willpower, and a truly heroic ability to ignore your own feet. Meanwhile, across town the boys were facing their own sartorial trial. While the girls dealt with layers upon layers, a young man's mission was simpler, but no less nerve-wracking. Acquire a suit that fit, or rent one that mostly did. The white dinner jacket was the height of prom fashion, paired with a bow tie and trousers with a crease sharp enough to cause injury. If you were renting, you prayed the shop had your size and had not already handed the good jacket to some other boy with better timing, and then you spent the entire evening terrified of spilling punch on a garment that technically did not belong to you. The white dinner jacket was the object of desire, the peak of teenage male sophistication, the garment that promised to transform an ordinary boy into something resembling a suave leading man. Paired with dark trousers, a crisp shirt and a bow tie, it was the uniform of the evening, and every boy wanted to wear it well. The trouble was that looking suave in a white dinner jacket requires the jacket to fit, and fitting, as many a boy discovered, was far from guaranteed. For most families, buying formal wear for a single night was an extravagance that made no sense, and so the rental shop entered the story. This was a place of racks and mirrors, and a tailor with a tape measure and a weary expression, having outfitted 100 nervous teenagers already that season. You went in, you got measured, and you placed your faith in the shop's inventory, hoping against hope that when your turn came, a jacket in your size would still be hanging there, and not already draped over the shoulders of some luckier, earlier arriving classmate. The fit was always an adventure. Rental jackets had lived many lives and been worn by many bodies, and they carried the vague memory of all of them. Sometimes the shoulders sat wrong, sometimes the sleeves reached for the floor, sometimes the trousers required a belt cinched to its very last hole, or a hasty fold and pin operation to stay in the vicinity of your waist. You stood before the mirror assessing the damage and concluding that it was, well, close enough, which was the official standard of the rented tuxedo. The bow tie was its own small battle. In an era before the convenient clip-on had fully conquered the land, tying an actual bow tie required either genuine skill, a patient father, or a great deal of trial and error in front of a mirror while the clock ticked. Get it right, and you looked debonair. Get it wrong, and you spent the evening with a slightly drunken-looking knot at your throat, which somewhat undercut the leading man effect you were going for, and the trousers, oh, the crease. Formal trousers came pressed with a crease down the front so sharp and so precise it seemed almost weaponized, and maintaining that crease became a background anxiety for the entire night. You sat carefully. You avoided anything that might wrinkle. You treated your own legs like fragile cargo, all in service of keeping that heroic line intact from arrival to the last dance. But the true defining terror of the rented tuxedo was the fear of ruining it. This was not your jacket. This was the shop's jacket, borrowed for one night against a deposit and a promise to return it unharmed, and every hazard of the evening became a threat to that promise. The bright red punch, the greasy diner food afterward, the girl's lipstick during a slow dance. Any one of them could leave a mark that would cost you dearly and haunt you for weeks. So you moved through your glamorous evening in a state of low, constant vigilance, dressed like a movie star and worrying like an accountant, guarding a white jacket that belonged to someone else with the fierce devotion of a man protecting the crown jewels. A boy's hair required its own campaign, and that campaign was fought with grease. The pompadour, that towering wave of hair swept up and back, did not happen by accident. It happened through the liberal application of pomade, a substance with the consistency of car wax and the staying power of concrete. You combed, you sculpted, you checked the mirror from 17 different angles, and you tucked a comb in your back pocket for emergency touch-ups throughout the night. The goal was to look like a movie idol. The risk was looking like you had emptied an entire tin of grease onto your head, which in fairness you had. Let's begin with the pomade itself, because it deserves both respect and suspicion. It came in a little tin, this thick, waxy, faintly scented substance, and a small amount went a very long way, though almost no boy ever believed that. You scooped out a fingerful, warmed it between your palms, and worked it through your hair until every strand was coated and cooperative. It smelled strongly of something meant to evoke sophistication, and mostly evoking a barbershop. It transferred to pillowcases, collars, and the hands of anyone unwise enough to touch your head. The sculpting was the true art. You did not simply comb the pomade in and walk away. You built. You swept the sides back toward the centre in the style known as the ducktail, so named because the back met in a neat little line resembling, well, a duck's rear end. You lifted the front up and back into the great cresting wave that gave the pompadour its name and its drama. It was architecture performed on your own skull, and it required patience, a steady hand, and a truly heroic quantity of product. The mirror sessions were extensive. You checked the front, you checked the sides, you held up a second mirror to check the back, contorting yourself to inspect the ducktail from angles the human neck was not designed to achieve. You made a small adjustment. You checked again. You made another. This could go on for a very long time, and your family members learned to knock and retreat, having witnessed the ritual before and knowing better than to interrupt a boy at war with his own hairline. The comb in the back pocket was standard equipment, the mark of a boy who took his hair seriously. Throughout the evening you would produce it, unprompted, and run it through the sides in a smooth, practiced motion, restoring order to any strand that dared to rebel. It was part grooming tool, part accessory, part nervous habit. A boy without a comb was a boy who had not thought this through. The whole enterprise was, of course, an attempt to look like the idols of the day, those effortlessly cool figures with their perfect waves of hair and their air of easy rebellion. You wanted that. You wanted to walk into the gymnasium looking like you'd been carved from teenage confidence itself, and when the pompadour worked, when the light caught it just right and the wave held its shape, you did look pretty magnificent, and you knew it. But there was always the risk of overcommitment. Too much pomade and the whole thing turned from sculpted to sodden, a helmet of grease that shone under the lights with an intensity that suggested a small oil spill. Get too close to a warm room, or dance a little too energetically, and the whole structure could begin a slow, glistening slide. So you monitored it. You touched it up. You guarded your pompadour with the vigilance of a man protecting a monument, because you had invested an entire tin of grease and a solid half hour into that head, and you were not about to let it collapse before the first slow dance. Let's talk money, because none of this glamour was free. For the average teenager, prom was a financial mountain to climb, $1 at a time. The dress, the tux, the corsage, the gas, the after-prom milkshakes, it all added up to a sum that could make a paper boy weep. So you worked. You babysat, you bagged groceries, you delivered newspapers in the freezing dark, you mowed lawns until your hands blistered. Every nickel went into a jar or a sock or somewhere safe from your younger siblings. And after all that saving, you would spend it in a single night and consider it money well spent mostly. Let's tally the expenses because they piled up with alarming speed. There was the outfit, whether bought, rented or sewn, and none of those options were truly cheap. There was the corsage, a small arrangement of flowers that somehow cost far more than a small arrangement of flowers ought to. There was gasoline for the borrowed car, tickets to the dance itself, and the near-obligatory trip to the diner afterward, where milkshakes and burgers for two added a final flourish to the bill. Each item seemed modest on its own. Together they formed a mountain. For a teenager without a steady income, the only path up that mountain was labour, and so you laboured. The paper route was a classic, a punishing dawn ritual of pedalling through cold, quiet streets, flinging newspapers toward porches with varying accuracy, your breath fogging in the early air while the rest of the world slept warmly. It paid in coins and small bills, slowly, over weeks and months, and every one of those coins was earmarked for the great glittering event on the horizon. Babysitting was another avenue, an evening spent minding someone else's restless children in exchange for a modest handful of change and whatever snacks the family left out. Bagging groceries at the local market offered slightly steadier pay and the chance to stand on your feet for hours perfecting the art of not crushing the bread. And then there was lawn mowing, that sweaty summer standby, pushing a mower back and forth across the neighbourhood until your palms toughened into something resembling leather. The saving itself was a discipline, and it required defences. You did not simply keep your earnings loose in a drawer, because a house full of younger siblings was a house full of small, curious, financially unscrupulous individuals. So you hid it. A jar tucked at the back of a closet, a sock stuffed into the toe of a shoe, an envelope taped somewhere only you knew. You counted it periodically in secret, watching the total climb toward the magic number with the quiet satisfaction of a miser. There was something almost noble about it, this slow accumulation of small money toward a single shining goal. It taught you the value of $1 in the most direct way possible, because every dollar in that jar represented a specific quantity of freezing mornings or howling toddlers or blistered palms. You knew exactly what your prom cost because you had earned it in increments you could still feel in your aching back. And then, in one glorious evening, you spent it. Months of pre-dawn paper routes and lawn mowing and babysitting converted into a corsage, a tank of gas, and a couple of milkshakes, gone in a single night that would be over before you knew it. It should have felt foolish, spending so much so fast on something so fleeting. And yet, standing in that gymnasium in your hard-earned finery, watching your date smile under the crepe paper stars, you would decide it had all been worth it, mostly. It's time for one of prom's most delicate traditions, the corsage. The boy was expected to present his date with a small arrangement of flowers, a gesture of romance that came absolutely loaded with pressure. Choose the wrong flowers, the wrong colour, or the wrong style, and you had failed before the evening even began. Then came the truly perilous part, pinning it on. A wrist corsage was the safe option, but a pinned corsage required a young man to attach a flower to the front of a young lady's dress, in front of her parents, without fainting, fumbling, or accidentally stabbing anyone. Many a boy has aged a full decade in those 30 seconds. The trouble began at the florist, days before the event, when you were forced to make decisions you were in no way qualified to make. What flowers did she like? You had no idea. What colour was her dress? You'd been told once in passing, and had immediately forgotten, and now you stood before a bewildering array of blooms attempting to reconstruct the information from memory and panic. Roses seemed safe. Carnations were affordable. Orchids seemed impressive but risky. You made a choice and hoped, because hoping was really all you had. The colour coordination was a genuine minefield. The corsage was supposed to complement the dress, which meant you needed to know the dress, which meant you had needed to pay attention during a conversation weeks earlier when your entire mind had been occupied with the terror of the ask. Get it right, and you looked thoughtful and attentive. Get it wrong, pair a bright clashing bloom with a delicate pastel gown, and you announced to the world and to her mother that you had not been listening. The flowers told a story, and you very much wanted it to be a flattering one. Then came the presentation, the moment of handover, conducted in the living room under the full watchful attention of her assembled family. You produced the little box, opened it, and offered the flowers, and everyone leaned in to inspect your choice like judges at a competition. It was a small ceremony, brief, but waited. And you performed it with sweating palms and a smile you hoped read as charming rather than terrified. But the true trial, the peak of the whole ordeal, was the pinning. A wrist corsage was the coward's way out, and a blessed way it was. A simple band slipped over the hand with no danger involved. But the traditional corsage was pinned to the dress, and pinning a corsage to the front of a girl's gown, near the shoulder, in front of her father, using a sharp metal pin, while your hands shook like leaves in a gale, was one of the defining terrors of teenage life. Consider the hazards. The pin was sharp. Your hands were unsteady. The location was delicately put in a region no teenage boy wished to fumble around in front of a girl's parents. You had to get close, take hold of the fabric, and drive a pin through it and the flower stem without pricking her, without dropping the corsage, and without making the whole thing take so long that the room descended into agonizing silence. Fathers watched. Mothers watched. The clock seemed to slow, and so you did it, or you tried to, in those 30 endless seconds that felt like a small lifetime. Maybe it went smoothly, the pin sliding home, the flower settling into place, a small triumph greeted with warm smiles all around. Or maybe you fumbled, dropped the pin, tried again, apologized twice, and emerged from the encounter visibly older and slightly damp. Either way, the corsage was on, the flower was in place, and you had survived one of prom's most quietly harrowing rituals, ready to face the merely ordinary terrors that lay ahead. In return, the girl provided a boutonniere, a single flower pinned to the lapel of the boy's jacket. This was the polite exchange rate of prom romance. You give me a corsage, I give you a small flower and the honour of wearing it. Pinning the boutonniere was slightly less terrifying than pinning the corsage, but only slightly, since it still involved sharp objects, trembling hands, and the watchful eyes of parents who were absolutely taking mental notes. If the flower survived the pinning and lasted through the first dance without wilting or dropping off, you both quietly counted it as a triumph. The boutonniere was the boy's counterpart to the corsage, a single modest bloom, usually a carnation or a small rosebud, destined for the lapel of his jacket. It was the return volley in the floral exchange, the girl's contribution to the evening's coordinated decoration, chosen to complement his outfit and, ideally, to harmonise with her own dress and corsage so that the two of them presented as a matched set. It was a small thing, but small things carried enormous weight in the delicate economy of prom. There was a pleasing symmetry to the whole arrangement. He gave flowers, she gave a flower. He pinned hers on, she pinned his on. It was a little ritual of mutual adornment, a way of marking the two of you as a pair, as belonging together for the evening, each wearing a piece of the other's thoughtfulness. In a world of strict roles and careful etiquette, this exchange was one of the sweeter, more balanced traditions, a moment where both parties gave and both received. Pinning it on was, admittedly, less fraught than the corsage ordeal, but let us not pretend it was without peril. The lapel was a safer target than the front of a gown, more clearly defined, less likely to lead to a mortifying fumble. But it still involved a sharp pin, still required steady hands, and still took place under the surveillance of parents who missed nothing and remembered everything. You threaded the pin through the fabric of the lapel and the stem of the flower, working with care, aware that one slip could prick him or send the whole bloom tumbling to the floor. The trembling hands were still very much a factor. Even the girl, generally the more composed of the two on this evening of nerves, might find her fingers uncooperative under the pressure of the moment and the audience. There was something about performing a delicate task while everyone watched that turned ordinarily capable hands into clumsy approximations of themselves. You steadied yourself, you took a breath, and you got the pin through on the second or third attempt, exhaling only when it held. The parents, of course, observed all of it, and they were absolutely taking mental notes. Every gesture, every courtesy, every fumble and recovery was filed away for later discussion. Did he stand politely while she pinned it? Did she handle herself gracefully? Was the flower well chosen? The pinning of the boutonniere was, like so much of the evening, a small performance stage for an audience of grown-ups forming quiet opinions about the whole affair. And then there was the endurance test, because a boutonniere had to survive. A carnation or rosebud pinned to a lapel led a hard life, jostled through car rides, crushed against dance partners, subjected to the heat of a crowded gymnasium. If it made it through the first dance still intact, still upright, still recognisably a flower, and not a sad wilted smear, you both quietly counted it as a victory. It was a small thing to celebrate, a single surviving bloom, but on a night built entirely out of small things, it was a triumph worth savouring. No prom night was complete without transportation, and for most boys that meant one thing: begging to borrow the family car. This was the 1950s, the golden age of the automobile, when a car with tail fins and chrome was a rolling statement of everything good in the world. Convincing your father to hand over the keys to his pride and joy required negotiation, promises, and possibly a signed blood oath to return it without a single scratch. You washed it, waxed it, and checked the gas twice. And then you drove off into the evening, praying you would never have to explain a dented fender to a man who loved that car more than he loved most people. Let's appreciate what a car meant in this era, because it was so much more than a way of getting places. This was the golden age of the American automobile, when cars came adorned with soaring tail fins, gleaming chrome bumpers, and colours that suggested optimism itself. A car was a statement, a symbol of prosperity and freedom, and the boundless promise of the age. And your father's car, whatever it was to him a treasured possession, tended and polished and regarded with a devotion he rarely showed to living creatures, which is precisely why asking to borrow it was such a delicate diplomatic operation. You did not simply ask. You built a case. You chose your moment, waiting until he was in a good mood, well fed and relaxed, and you approached the subject with the caution of a man diffusing something volatile. You made your promises, and they were extensive. Careful driving, an early return, not a scratch, not a smudge, not a single grain of dirt out of place. It was less a request and less a negotiation than a solemn treaty. The promises escalated as needed. You would fill the tank. You would drive below the speed limit at all times. You would guard the vehicle with your very life. You would, if it came to it, throw yourself bodily in front of any threat to its pristine finish. Your father listened, weighed your sincerity, considered the risks, and eventually, grudgingly, produced the keys, handing them over with the expression of a man entrusting his firstborn to a stranger. Then came the preparation, because you were not about to take his beloved machine out into the world without first honouring it properly. You washed it until it gleamed. You waxed it until it shone. You checked the gas, then checked it again, because arriving at the pump or, heaven forbid, running dry mid-evening was not among the catastrophes you were willing to risk. You wanted to return the car in better condition than you had received it, a gesture of respect and more practically self-preservation. Driving it was an experience coloured entirely by fear. This was not a joyful cruise. This was the transport of precious, irreplaceable cargo. You drove with exaggerated care, both hands on the wheel, checking mirrors obsessively, treating every other vehicle on the road as a reckless threat to your father's masterpiece. Every parking lot became a gauntlet of potential door dings. Every gravel road threatened a chipped windshield. You aged considerably behind that wheel, and underneath it all ran the single powerful motivating dread, the conversation you would have to have if anything went wrong. The vision of returning home to explain a dented fender, a scraped bumper, or, unthinkably, a scratch in the paint, to a man who cherished this car above most of his relationships. That vision kept you cautious, it kept you slow, it kept you praying quietly and continuously all through the glamorous evening that you would deliver the chariot home exactly as immaculate as it had left and live to borrow it another day. Now comes the true test of courage, arriving at your date's house to collect her. This was not a simple honk from the driveway situation. Oh no! You had to walk up to the front door, ring the bell, and step directly into the lion's den, otherwise known as the living room, where her father sat waiting like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. There would be small talk, stiff and painful. There would be pointed questions about your intentions, your grades, and precisely what time you planned to have her home. And through all of it you had to smile, be polite, and pretend your heart was not trying to escape through your throat. Let us first dispense with any notion that you could take the easy route. You could not pull up to the curb and honk the horn, summoning your date like a taxi. That was unthinkable, a breach of etiquette so severe it would mark you forever as a boy of poor breeding and worse manners. No, the ritual demanded that you park the car, walk up the path, and present yourself at the front door in person, hat metaphorically in hand, ready to be inspected. Ringing the bell was the point of no return. You stood on the porch, corsages box clutched in one sweating hand, and pressed the button, and then you waited in that awful suspended moment before the door opened. When it did, it often revealed not your date, but her father, filling the doorway, taking your measure in a single sweeping glance that seemed to catalogue every flaw you possessed. He invited you in. You entered the living room. The door closed behind you. The lion's den had claimed another victim. The living room ordeal followed a predictable and excruciating script. You were directed to sit, and you perched on the edge of a sofa, back straight, trying to appear both respectful and relaxed, and achieving neither. Her father settled into his chair, and the questioning began, disguised as friendly conversation, but carrying the unmistakable weight of interrogation. How were your grades? What did your father do? What were your plans for the future? Each question was a small examination, and you were being scored. The small talk itself was a special agony, stiff and halting, full of long pauses during which the clock on the mantel ticked with cruel volume. You searched desperately for things to say, landing on the weather, on sports, on anything neutral and safe. Father offered short replies and continued to study you. Somewhere in the house you could hear the sounds of your date finishing her preparations, and you prayed she would hurry, because every minute alone in that room shaved another year off your life. Then came the pointed questions, the ones that got to the heart of the matter. What exactly were your intentions for the evening? What time did you intend to bring her home? These were not really questions. They were warnings, delivered in the calm, measured tone of a man who wanted you to understand precisely what would happen if his daughter were returned late or unhappy. You answered with earnest reassurances, promising an early and respectful return, meaning every word. And through the entire performance you had to maintain composure. You smiled. You were polite. You addressed him as sir and nodded at appropriate intervals and pretended with all your might that your heart was not hammering against your ribs and your collar was not slowly strangling you. It was a test of nerve as much as manners, this gauntlet of the living room, and passing it earned you the evening's true prize. The moment your date finally appeared at the top of the stairs, radiant, and the two of you could at last escape out the front door into the freedom of the night. Before anyone could leave, there was a ritual that simply had to be observed. The photograph. Someone's parent, armed with a camera and an alarming amount of enthusiasm, would herd the two of you into a corner of the living room for the official prom portrait. You stood stiffly side by side, the boy usually looking as though he'd been starched along with his shirt, The girl arranged just so, both of you instructed to smile in a way that felt entirely unnatural. Flashbulbs popped, blinding you temporarily. Poses were adjusted and readjusted. And the whole time you were told to stand up straight, stop fidgeting, and for heaven's sake look happy. This is supposed to be the best night of your life. The moment you thought you had survived the living room and could make your escape, the camera appeared, and with it, the parent operating it, radiating an enthusiasm entirely out of proportion to the occasion. This was a documented event, and documentation required cooperation. You were not going anywhere until the official prom portrait had been captured for posterity, whether you liked it or not, and your feelings on the matter were not consulted. You were herded into position, usually a corner of the living room deemed to have adequate lighting, and a suitable backdrop, perhaps in front of the fireplace or beside a tasteful houseplant. There you were arranged side by side, and the arranging was surprisingly involved. Stand here. No, closer. Turn slightly. He puts his hand there. She holds her flowers like so. You are posed like mannequins, positioned and repositioned by a director who took the work very seriously indeed. The boy in these photographs almost always achieved a particular quality of stiffness, as though he had been starched right along with his shirt collar, trapped in a rented jacket, freshly interrogated by the father, and now instructed to appear at ease. He tended to stand rigid and unblinking, wearing a smile that suggested mild discomfort rather than joy. The girl, better rehearsed in the art of being photographed, usually managed something closer to grace, though even she had her limits. The command to smile was where things fell apart, because being told to smile is one of the surest ways to make a genuine smile impossible. You bared your teeth, you held the expression, and the longer you held it, the more artificial it became, until your face ached and your smile curdled into a strange fixed grimace that would be preserved forever in the family album as evidence of the happiest night of your youth. Then the flashbulb fired, and the flashbulb was no gentle thing. It erupted in a burst of light so bright and sudden that it left you blinking away glowing spots for the next several seconds, your vision swimming, your carefully held smile dissolving into a squint. And of course a single photograph was never enough. There were retakes. That one was blurry. That one had your eyes closed. Stand up straight. Stop fidgeting. Let's do one more and one more after that. The photographer offered a steady stream of direction throughout. Most of it some variation on the same themes. Stand up straight. Stop fidgeting. Look happy. This is supposed to be the best night of your life, delivered in a tone that made the best night sound suspiciously like an obligation. You obeyed, you posed, you smiled through the flashing and the blindness, because you understood that this ritual had to be completed before you would be released. And released you eventually were, blinking and slightly dazed, your faces sore from forced cheer, the evidence safely captured. Decades later, those very photographs would resurface, stiff and glowing and faintly ridiculous, and you would look at them with unexpected fondness, grateful, in the end, that some enthusiastic parent had refused to let you leave without standing still and smiling, whether you wanted to or not. Finally, you arrive at the venue, which was almost always the one place you tried to avoid all year, the school gymnasium. But tonight it had been transformed, and the transformation was frankly heroic. Gone were the basketball hoops and the lingering smell of gym socks, or at least they were mostly hidden behind an ocean of crepe paper, cardboard and balloons. There was always a theme, something dreamy and far away like a starlit night, a tropical paradise, or Paris in the springtime, all recreated using construction paper and the fevered imagination of the prom committee. You stepped inside, and for one shining moment, it almost looked like magic. Almost. There was a particular irony in the venue, and it was not lost on anyone. The gymnasium was, for most of the year, a place of dread and humiliation, the site of dodgeball defeats and forced rope climbing and the general misery of physical education. It smelled of rubber mats and old sweat and the accumulated athletic suffering of generations of students. And yet this, of all places, was where the most magical night of the year would unfold, because it was the only room in the school large enough to hold everyone. So the prom committee went to war with the space, and the war was waged with construction paper. In the days leading up to the event, this dedicated band of volunteers descended upon the gym with ladders, staple guns, and boundless optimism, determined to transform the athletic wasteland into something enchanting. They draped, they hung, they stapled, they covered every offending surface they could reach, layering the room in crepe paper until the gymnasium beneath very nearly disappeared. The basketball hoops presented a particular challenge, being large, industrial, and stubbornly present. The committee did its best, wrapping them, disguising them, angling decorations to draw the eye elsewhere. But a basketball hoop is a difficult thing to fully hide, and it tended to loom over the proceedings like an uninvited guest who had at least agreed to wear a costume. The lingering smell of gym socks, too, proved resistant to crepe paper, persisting faintly beneath the punch and the perfume as a reminder of the room's true nature. The theme was the heart of the whole effort, and the themes were gloriously ambitious. A starlit night, achieved with cardboard stars and dangling silver ornaments. A tropical paradise, conjured from paper palm trees and construction paper flowers. Paris in the springtime, evoked by a hand-painted Eiffel Tower of dubious proportions and a great deal of romantic hope. Whatever the theme, it was rendered entirely in paper, glue, and the fevered collective imagination of teenagers who had never seen the places they were attempting to recreate. And the remarkable thing, the genuinely touching thing, was how well it almost worked. You stepped through the doors, out of the ordinary world and into this handmade fantasy, and for one shining moment the illusion held. The lights were low, the decorations shimmered, the music drifted across the transformed space, and if you let yourself believe it, if you did not look too closely, the gymnasium fell away, and you stood instead beneath a canopy of stars, or among the palms of a distant island, or on a Parisian street in spring. Almost. Because the magic was always just a little bit fragile, held together with staples and tape and wishful thinking. Look too closely and the stars were cardboard, the palm trees were paper, and the Eiffel Tower listed slightly to one side. But that was part of its charm, this earnest, imperfect, handmade wonder. Someone had cared enough to try to build you a dream out of construction paper, and standing there in the doorway in your finest clothes, you decided for one night to believe in it. Let's address the true rulers of the evening, the chaperones. Every prom came equipped with a small army of adults whose entire purpose was to ensure that absolutely no one had too much fun. Teachers, parents, the principal, and at least one gym coach patrolled the edges of the dance floor like hawks scanning a field for mice. They watched the dancing. They watched the punch bowl. They watched the dark corners with particular suspicion. And nothing, absolutely nothing, escaped the notice of a chaperone who had volunteered specifically for the joy of catching teenagers doing something they should not. The chaperones were a diverse and formidable coalition, drawn from every corner of adult authority available to the school. There were the teachers, of course, familiar faces now stationed in an unfamiliar and even more watchful capacity. There were parents, some of them belonging to your classmates, which added a special layer of dread. There was the principal himself lending the occasion the gravity of the highest office. And there was always, always at least one gym coach whose entire professional life had prepared him for the vigilant monitoring of teenagers in a gymnasium. Their positioning was strategic. They arranged themselves around the perimeter of the dance floor, along the walls near the exits, beside the refreshment table, forming a ring of surveillance from which nothing on the floor could escape. They stood with arms crossed or hands clasped, scanning the crowd with the patient, unblinking attention of predators who had all evening and were in no particular hurry. To dance beneath their collective gaze was to feel at all times thoroughly and completely observed. The dancing was watched most intently of all, because the dancing was where the greatest dangers were thought to lurk. A chaperone could assess the distance between two dancing partners from clear across the gymnasium, and the moment the distance shrank below the approved minimum, action would be taken. They monitored the swaying couples the way an air traffic controller monitors the skies, alert to any drift, any lean, any suggestion of closeness that exceeded the strict standards of the evening. The punch bowl received its own dedicated attention, guarded against the legendary and eternal threat of spiking with a vigilance bordering on the paranoid. A chaperone was very often stationed directly beside it, ladle at the ready, eyes scanning every approaching teenager for signs of mischief. The dark corners, too, drew particular suspicion. Those shadowy edges of the room where the crepe paper cast gloom, and where a couple might imagine foolishly that they had found a moment of privacy. There was no privacy. There were only corners the chaperones had not yet walked past. What made the chaperones so effective and so quietly terrifying was their evident enthusiasm. Many of them had volunteered. They had chosen this. They were not reluctant draftees grudgingly serving their time. They were dedicated professionals who took genuine satisfaction in the maintenance of order and the thwarting of teenage schemes. A chaperone who had signed up specifically for the pleasure of catching young people misbehaving was a chaperone operating at the very peak of her powers, and so the entire evening unfolded beneath their watchful eyes, a glittering party conducted under conditions of near-total surveillance. You danced knowing you were watched. You drank punch knowing you were watched. You retreated to a corner knowing, or soon learning, that you were watched there too. The chaperones missed nothing, forgave little, and roamed the edges of your magical night like the stern guardians they were, ensuring that fun remained firmly within its approved and clearly defined limits. With the adults watching, you had to mind your manners, because 1950s prom arrived with an entire code of conduct. A gentleman fetched the punch. A gentleman offered his arm. A gentleman did not, under any circumstances, dance too close or behave in a way that might get his date talked about. There were expectations for how you spoke, how you sat, how you carried yourself, and how you treated your date, all enforced by a blend of tradition, chaperones, and the crushing fear of public embarrassment. Good manners were not optional. They were the price of admission to the whole glittering evening. The code of conduct was extensive, largely unwritten, and known to everyone regardless, absorbed over years from parents and films and the general expectations of polite society. It governed nearly every aspect of your behaviour, from the grand gestures down to the smallest courtesies, and it applied with particular force on an evening as important and as closely observed as this one. To violate it was not merely rude, it was to risk the kind of talk that could follow you through the halls for weeks. For the gentleman, the duties were clear and numerous. It fell to him to fetch the punch, crossing the floor to the refreshment table and returning with a cup for his date, a small act of service performed countless times over the course of the night. It fell to him to offer his arm as they walked, to guide her gently and attentively through the crowd. It fell to him, generally, to anticipate her needs and to see to her comfort, playing the role of the courteous escort with earnest, if sometimes clumsy, dedication. There were things a gentleman simply did not do, and chief among them was dancing too close. The approved distance was to be maintained at all times, not merely to satisfy the chaperones, but to protect his date's reputation, which was, in this era, a fragile and precious thing. A boy who held his partner too near, who behaved in any way that might invite comment, was doing her a disservice, exposing her to gossip and judgment. And so, a considerate young man kept a respectful gap, mindful always of how the evening might be discussed afterward. The expectations extended to speech and bearing as well. There was a way one spoke at such an occasion, politely, pleasantly, without coarseness or excessive volume. There was a way one sat, upright and composed rather than sprawled or slouched. There was a way one carried oneself across the floor, with a dignity befitting the formality of the night. All of it combined into a general standard of comportment that everyone was expected to meet, and most, under the circumstances, did their best to. The treatment of one's date was perhaps the most important element of all. She was to be treated with respect, with attentiveness, with courtesy at every turn. He listened when she spoke. He saw to it that she was included, comfortable and enjoying herself. The entire code, in a sense, oriented itself around this principle, that the evening was a partnership conducted with mutual consideration, and that a young man was judged above all by how well he treated the young lady on his arm. Enforcement came from 3 directions at once, forming a net from which there was no real escape. There was tradition, the deep-seated sense of how things ought to be done, internalized since childhood. There were the chaperones, ever present and ever watchful, ready to correct any lapse. And there was the fear, that most powerful enforcer of all, the crushing dread of public embarrassment, of being the one who got it wrong, who committed the faux pas that everyone would remember. Between the 3 of them, good manners were guaranteed. They were, as much as the ticket in your pocket, the true price of admission to the whole glittering, closely watched, impeccably polite affair. Now for the heartbeat of the night, the music. In the earlier part of the decade, prom meant a live band playing the smooth, swaying sounds of big band and slow romantic standards, the kind of music your parents heartily approved of. But something was changing in the air. Rock and roll was creeping in, loud and rebellious and thrilling, and the adults did not care for it one bit. You might get a whole evening of gentle crooning, or, if you were lucky, the band might slip in something with a beat that made the chaperones frown and the teenagers come alive. Either way, the music set the tone, and the tone was electric. Let's start with the respectable option, the music your parents grew up on and heartily endorsed. In the earlier years of the decade, prom music meant a live band, real musicians with real instruments arranged at one end of the gymnasium, playing the smooth, gentle standards of the big band era. There were slow numbers built for swaying, romantic ballads sung by a crooner with a warm voice and a nice suit, the kind of music that encouraged closeness of a strictly approved and chaperone-monitored variety. This was music the adults understood, and their approval was total. It was elegant. It was decent. It reminded them pleasantly of their own youth, and it posed no threat to the moral order of the evening. Couples swayed to it at respectful distance. The chaperones tapped their feet contentedly, and everyone agreed that this was exactly the sort of wholesome entertainment a prom ought to provide. It was safe, and safety, in the eyes of the grown-ups, was very much the goal. But something was stirring in the culture, something loud and restless and impossible to ignore. Rock and roll had arrived, and it was everything the standards were not. It was fast. It was rebellious. It had a driving beat that made you want to move in ways that had nothing whatsoever to do with respectful swaying. The teenagers loved it with a passion that alarmed their elders, and the tension between the old music and the new played out on prom floors across the country. The adults, needless to say, did not care for it. To their ears, rock and roll was noise, a chaotic racket that stirred up exactly the sort of energy a well-chaperoned evening was designed to suppress. They viewed it with suspicion, this loud new sound that made their children behave strangely, and they would have banned it entirely from the gymnasium if they thought they could get away with it. Often, the band was gently instructed to keep things tasteful, and so the evening became a kind of quiet negotiation conducted through the music. You might get a whole night of the smooth and the slow, the safe and the sanctioned, and it would be lovely in its way. Or, if fortune smiled, the band might sense the restlessness in the room and slip in something with a beat, something modern, something that made the floor come alive. The moment it happened, the transformation was instant and unmistakable. The reaction told you everything. The chaperones' faces would tighten into disapproving frowns, their vigilance sharpening as they sensed the shift in the air, and the teenagers, meanwhile, would light up, energized, drawn to the floor by the irresistible pull of the new sound. It was a small rebellion, this handful of upbeat numbers snuck into an evening of standards, and everyone on both sides understood exactly what was happening. Whatever the balance struck on any given night, the music was the heartbeat of the whole affair, the force that set the mood and moved the crowd and gave the evening its shape. Slow and sweet or fast and thrilling, sanctioned or slightly forbidden, it filled the transformed gymnasium and carried the night along. And in that tension between the old and the new, between the crooners your parents loved and the rebellious beat you craved, you could feel something larger stirring, the sound of one era quietly, electrically giving way to the next. It's time to dance, and here is where the famous rule came into play: leave room for the Holy Ghost. This was the chaperone's polite way of insisting that couples keep a respectable distance at all times, ideally enough space for a third party of a divine nature. Slow dances were watched most closely of all. Any couple who drifted too near would earn a tap on the shoulder and a stern reminder to separate. So you swayed at arm's length, gazing into each other's eyes across a carefully maintained gap, doing your very best to be romantic while a teacher somewhere counted the inches between you. The phrase itself was a small masterpiece of gentle enforcement, delivered with a smile that did not soften the underlying command. Leave room for the Holy Ghost. It meant in plain terms that you and your partner were to maintain a gap between you at all times, a space wide enough that a third presence of a sacred nature might comfortably fit. It was the era's charming, faintly absurd way of insisting that closeness had firm and non-negotiable limits. The slow dances were the front line of this campaign, watched with an intensity that bordered on the surgical. A fast number posed little danger. You could hardly get too close while both flailing about to an upbeat tune. But a slow dance invited exactly the sort of proximity the chaperones had dedicated their evening to preventing, and so they watched those moments with the concentrated attention of border guards, alert to every closing inch. The enforcement mechanism was swift and effective. Should a couple begin to drift together, should the approved gap begin to narrow towards something warmer, a chaperone would materialize seemingly from nowhere and deliver the correction. A tap on the shoulder, a meaningful look, a quiet, firm reminder to separate, to restore the proper distance, to remember, please, the Holy Ghost and its need for room. And the couple would dutifully drift apart, chastened, resuming the sanctioned gap. So you learned to dance within the rules, and dancing within the rules was its own peculiar art. You held your partner at arm's length, your hands positioned correctly and conservatively, your bodies separated by a respectful expanse of gymnasium air. You swayed together but apart, moving in a kind of coordinated parallel, close enough to feel that you were dancing together, far enough to satisfy the watchful eyes ringing the floor. And within that carefully maintained gap, you did your absolute best to be romantic, which was no small challenge given the circumstances. You gazed into each other's eyes across the divide. You spoke softly, sharing whatever tender words the moment allowed. You tried, with all your teenage sincerity, to make the dance feel intimate and special and meaningful, all while knowing that somewhere at the edge of the floor, a teacher was quite literally assessing the inches between you. There was something almost comic about it, this earnest striving for romance conducted under conditions of active surveillance and enforced distance. You were young and full of feeling, swaying with someone you very much liked, beneath dimmed lights and cardboard stars, and you wanted nothing more than to hold them close, and you could not because the rules would not permit it, and so you channeled all that longing into a look, a whispered word, a hand held just so across the regulation gap. And yet, for all its restrictions, the dancing worked its magic anyway. There was a tenderness to it, a sweetness in the restraint, a heightened significance to every small permitted gesture precisely because so much was forbidden. Swaying at arm's length beneath the crepe paper, gazing across the divine gap into the eyes of your date, you found that romance survived even the closest chaperoning. It simply learned to live in the space of a held glance and a whispered word, which, when you were young and hopeful and dressed in your very best, turned out to be more than enough. Let's gather at the social heart of every prom, the refreshment table ruled by the mighty punch bowl. The punch itself was a sweet, fruity, brightly coloured concoction, usually harmless, always sticky. But the punch bowl carried a legend that trailed it through every prom in America. The rumour of the spiking. Somewhere, someone always claimed that a daring boy had snuck something stronger into the bowl while the chaperones were not looking. Whether it was true or simply a tale passed down from class to class, the chaperones guarded that bowl like it held the crown jewels, ladling out cup after cup while scanning the room for troublemakers. The refreshment table was the natural gathering place, the spot where you drifted between dances to catch your breath, cool down, and conduct the important social business of the evening. And presiding over it all was the punch bowl, a great vessel of brightly coloured liquid that served as both refreshment and centrepiece. It was where you went to see and be seen, to rest your aching feet, and to load up on sugar for the dancing still to come. The punch itself was a marvel of mid-century refreshment, a sweet and fruity concoction in a colour rarely found in nature, some vivid shade of red or orange or improbable green. It was usually a mix of fruit juices and ginger ale, occasionally floating with a ring of sherbet or a raft of fruit slices, and it was reliably, aggressively sweet. It was also invariably sticky, coating cups and hands and the table around the bowl in a fine sugary residue that no amount of wiping ever fully defeated. But the punch bowl was famous less for what it contained than for what it might contain, because trailing it through every prom in America was one enduring, irresistible legend, the rumour of the spiking. It was a tale as old as prom itself, whispered from class to class, year to year, that somewhere, at some point in the evening, a bold and daring boy would seize his moment and pour something considerably stronger into the innocent bowl while the adults looked elsewhere. Whether the spiking ever actually happened was almost beside the point. Sometimes, surely it did. Some enterprising teenager smuggling in a small bottle and finding his opening. More often, it was simply a story, a piece of prom mythology passed down and embellished, a rumour that ran ahead of any actual bottle. But the legend persisted regardless, part hope and part warning. casting every cup of punch under a faint cloud of delicious suspicion. The chaperones, needless to say, took the threat with deadly seriousness. The rumour of the spiking was, to them, not a charming legend but a genuine menace to the good order of the evening, and they responded accordingly. The punch bowl was guarded as though it held something precious and endangered, watched over with a vigilance that never wavered. Very often a chaperone was stationed at the table itself, ladle in hand, personally overseeing the distribution of every single cup. From that post, the guardian of the punch performed two duties at once. She ladled out serving after serving to the thirsty teenagers filing past, a tireless dispenser of sticky refreshment, and all the while she scanned the room over the rim of the bowl, eyes moving across the crowd in search of troublemakers, of suspicious movements, of any boy who lingered too long or approached with a shifty look and a suspiciously bulky jacket. Nothing was getting into that bowl on her watch, and so the punch bowl reigned over the evening as a small drama all its own, part refreshment station and part contested territory. The teenagers came for the sugar and stayed for the gossip, sipping their harmless fruity punch while trading the eternal rumours about whether tonight, finally, someone had dared. The chaperones stood guard, ladling and scanning, defending the bowl's innocence with everything they had, and the legend, spiked or not, lived on to be passed to the next class and the next, as durable and sweet and sticky as the punch itself. Every prom reached a dramatic climax with the crowning of the prom king and queen, a moment of glory, envy, and quiet heartbreak. This was essentially a popularity contest dressed up in a paper crown, and everyone knew it. The votes had been cast, the results were sealed, and now the whole gymnasium held its breath as the names were read aloud. For the winners, it was a coronation, a shining moment atop the teenage social ladder. For everyone else, it was a chance to clap politely while privately calculating exactly how the vote had gone so terribly wrong. Democracy, prom style. The crowning was the evening's great ceremonial peak, the moment toward which the whole night seemed to build. At some point in the proceedings, the music would pause, the lights would shift, and an announcement would draw everyone's attention toward the front of the gymnasium where the coronation was about to unfold. A hush would fall over the crowd, that particular electric silence that precedes the revelation of a much-anticipated result. Let us be honest about what the contest actually measured, because everyone in the room already understood it perfectly. This was a popularity contest, plain and simple, dressed up in the trappings of ceremony and topped with a paper crown. The titles of king and queen went not to the most virtuous or the most kind or the most deserving, but to the most popular, the students who sat at the summit of the mysterious and merciless social hierarchy of the school. No one pretended otherwise. The mechanics were those of a small election. Votes had been cast earlier, ballots marked and collected and tallied in secret, and now the results sat sealed and ready to be revealed. As the names were prepared for reading, the whole gymnasium held its breath, and in that suspended moment every student in the room ran the same private calculations, weighing the likely candidates, bracing for the outcome, hoping against hope, or resigned to the probable. Then the names were read aloud, and the room split instantly into two very different experiences. For the winners, it was pure glory, a coronation in the most literal sense. The paper crown lowered onto the head, the applause swelling, the spotlight found at last. They stepped forward to claim their titles, elevated in that moment to the very top of the teenage world, radiant and triumphant, living the fantasy that every teen movie had promised was possible. For everyone else, the experience was rather more complicated, a delicate performance of gracious defeat. You clapped, You smiled. You joined in the applause for the newly crowned royalty with every appearance of genuine goodwill. And privately, silently, behind that supportive smile, you conducted your own quiet post-mortem, calculating exactly how the vote had unfolded, how these particular names had risen above all others, how the whole thing had gone, in your considered private opinion, so terribly and obviously wrong. There was, beneath the glitter and the applause, a real undercurrent of feeling to the whole affair, and much of it was tender and a little sad. For every crown handed out, a room full of hopefuls quietly absorbed the confirmation that the crown was not for them. There were small heartbreaks scattered through that applauding crowd. Students who had dreamed, however faintly, of hearing their own name called, now clapping for someone else's moment in the light. And so the crowning stood as prom's grand climax, a ceremony equal parts celebration and quiet reckoning, democracy conducted in paper crowns and sealed ballots. It gave the popular their shining coronation and gave everyone else a lesson in the graceful acceptance of the social order. It was glorious and it was cruel, and it was above all entirely honest about what it was, and every student in that breathless gymnasium understood the game completely, even as they clapped along and privately disputed the results. Beneath all the rules and watchful eyes, prom was, at its core, about romance, and nothing captured that better than the slow dance. The lights dimmed just slightly, the band eased into something tender, and couples drifted onto the floor to sway together, or rather, to sway at the regulation distance. This was the moment everyone had secretly been waiting for all night. Hands trembled, hearts pounded. Words that had been rehearsed all week either came out perfectly or dissolved into nervous mumbling. And for a few precious minutes, under a canopy of crepe paper stars, the whole complicated evening felt entirely worth it. Strip away all the elaborate machinery of the evening, the dresses and the girdles and the chaperones and the paper crowns, and what remained at the centre of it all was this simple, universal thing: romance. Prom was, when you got right down to it, an occasion built around young people liking each other, and no single moment distilled that purpose more purely than the slow dance. It was the emotional heart of the whole affair, the thing everyone had been quietly building toward all night. The transition into a slow dance had its own gentle choreography. The lights, already low, would dim just a fraction further, softening the gymnasium into something warmer and more forgiving. The band would ease down out of whatever they had been playing and slide into something tender, a soft and swaying number built for closeness. And across the room couples would set down their punch cups, exchange a look, and drift onto the floor to take their positions for the dance that mattered most. They swayed together, or rather, in keeping with the ironclad law of the evening, they swayed at the carefully maintained regulation distance, close enough to hold each other, and far enough to satisfy the ever-watchful chaperones. But even within that enforced gap, the slow dance carried a charge unlike anything else in the night. This was the moment everyone had secretly been waiting for, the reason, if they were honest, that half of them had come at all. The physical symptoms were unmistakable and universal. Hands trembled as they found their proper positions, one at the shoulder, one clasped, all of them betraying the nervousness underneath. Hearts pounded so hard you were half convinced your partner could hear them over the music. There was a heightened awareness to everything, the warmth of a hand, the nearness of a face, the sheer, overwhelming significance of the moment, all of it magnified by youth and hope and the dreamlike atmosphere of the transformed room. And then there were the words, the things you had wanted to say, rehearsed all week in the privacy of your own head, polished and prepared for exactly this moment. Sometimes they came out beautifully, the perfect sentence delivered at the perfect time, a small triumph of romantic courage. And sometimes they dissolved entirely, collapsing into nervous mumbling, half-finished thoughts and awkward pauses, the carefully rehearsed lines scattering the instant they were needed. Either way, the attempt itself was tender. For those few precious minutes swaying beneath the canopy of crepe paper stars, the whole complicated, exhausting, expensive, tightly regulated evening finally justified itself. All the saving and the curlers and the interrogations and the surveillance, all of it fell away, and what was left was two young people moving together to a soft song under handmade stars, feeling something real and enormous and entirely their own. And that, in the end, was the whole point. The slow dance was what everyone remembered, long after the details faded, long after the paper stars came down and the gymnasium went back to smelling like gym socks. It was the emotional core that all the elaborate ritual had been built to protect and frame, a few fragile minutes of genuine romance beneath the decorations, and it was, for so many, entirely and completely worth every bit of the trouble it had taken to get there. Prom night ran on a strict set of gender roles, an invisible script everyone was expected to follow without question. The boy planned, paid, drove, and led. The girl waited to be asked, prepared for hours, and followed. He opened doors and pulled out chairs. She looked lovely and let him take the lead on the dance floor. These roles were rarely questioned, because this was simply how things were done, handed down from parents and reinforced by every movie, magazine, and advice column of the era. It was a carefully choreographed dance that began long before anyone ever reached the gymnasium. The entire evening operated according to a script no one had written down but everyone had memorized, a strict division of labor and expectation assigned by gender and followed almost without exception. The boy occupied one set of roles, the girl another, and the two fit together like the halves of a well-rehearsed performance. It shaped everything, from the first tentative steps of the ask all the way through to the final good night, and it was simply the water everyone swam in. The boy's portion of the script was defined by action and initiative. He was the one who planned, deciding the shape of the evening and arranging its parts. He was the one who paid, shouldering the considerable expense we have already agonized over. He was the one who drove, guiding the borrowed chariot through the night. And he was the one who led, taking the initiative at every turn, setting the course and steering the two of them through the evening's many stations. His was the active role, and much rested on his nervous shoulders. The girl's portion, by contrast, was defined largely by response and preparation. She waited to be asked, denied by custom the ability to take that first step herself, however much she might have wished to. She prepared, pouring hours into the transformation we have documented in exhausting detail, the dress and the hair and the face and the rest. And once the evening began, she followed, allowing the boy to lead, receiving his courtesies, playing the counterpart to his initiative in the great coordinated dance of the night. The specific courtesies were many and precise. He opened doors, moving ahead to hold them so she might pass through. He pulled out chairs, seeing her comfortably seated before taking his own place. He led on the dance floor, guiding their movements while she matched and followed. And she, for her part, looked lovely, received these attentions gracefully, and let him take the lead. The two of them performing a routine so familiar it required almost no thought at all. What is most striking, looking back, is how thoroughly these roles went unquestioned. They were not debated or negotiated or resented, at least not openly. They were simply how things were done, accepted as the natural order of a prom evening. To behave otherwise would have seemed strange, even to the young people themselves. So completely had the script been absorbed into their understanding of how the world worked, and absorbed it had been, from every direction at once. Parents handed it down, modelling and instructing and expecting. The movies reinforced it, showing the same roles played out on screen by glamorous stars. The magazines and advice columns of the era spelled it out explicitly, offering detailed guidance on exactly how a young lady and a young gentleman ought to conduct themselves. From every source came the same consistent message, and the young people learned it thoroughly. So the choreography was set long before anyone arrived at the transformed gymnasium, rehearsed over years of cultural instruction and family example. By the time you stepped onto that dance floor, you already knew your part completely. The boy his initiatives and courtesies, the girl her preparations and graceful following. It was a carefully coordinated performance, this business of prom, and its steps had been taught to both partners since long before either of them was old enough to dance. Not everyone was welcome under the crepe paper stars, and this part of the story deserves to be told plainly. In much of 1950s America, especially across the segregated South, black students were often barred from attending prom alongside their white classmates, or excluded from school dances altogether. Many communities held entirely separate proms, and in some places that divide would persist for decades to come. For countless teenagers, the magical night described here was simply not an option, not because of anything they had done, but because of the deep injustice woven into the era itself. It is a reminder that the nostalgia we feel for this time was never shared equally, and that behind the glittering image lies a harder truth worth remembering. For all the sweetness of the evening we've been describing, honesty requires us to set the picture straight, because the magical night under the crepe paper stars was not open to everyone. The 1950s are often remembered with a warm, nostalgic glow, all soda fountains and sock hops and innocent romance. But that glow obscures a great deal, and one of the things it obscures most completely is who was allowed to be there in the first place. In much of the country, and especially across the segregated South, black students were routinely kept from the proms of their white classmates. Segregation shaped nearly every corner of public and social life in these places, and the school dance was no exception. In many communities, black teenagers were simply barred from attending alongside their white peers, or excluded from official school dances altogether, shut out of a rite of passage that their classmates took for granted. Where separate arrangements existed, they were exactly that, separate. Many communities held entirely distinct proms, divided strictly along racial lines, a physical enactment of the broader segregation that governed daily life. And this was not merely a fleeting circumstance of the decade. In some places, the division of proms along racial lines would persist stubbornly for decades afterward, long after the laws that had underpinned segregation began to change. The point worth sitting with is this. For a great many teenagers, the entire glittering evening we have spent so long describing was simply not available to them. Not because of anything they had done, not through any fault or failing of their own, but because of the deep and pervasive injustice woven into the very fabric of the era. The doors of that transformed gymnasium were, for them, closed, and no amount of saving or preparation or hope could open them. It matters to say this plainly, without softening or hurrying past it, because the warm nostalgia we feel for this time was never a feeling shared equally by all who lived through it. The soft-focus memory of the perfect 1950s prom belongs to some and excludes others, and to remember the era honestly means holding both truths at once. The genuine sweetness experienced by those who are welcome, and the genuine exclusion endured by those who are not. Behind the glittering image, in other words, lies a harder truth, and it is a truth worth remembering rather than tucking away. The same evening that meant so much to so many was, for countless others, a closed door, a reminder of their place in a society that had decided unjustly that they didn't belong under the same paper stars. That reality was real, it was widespread, and it shaped the lives of a whole generation of young people who deserved every bit of the magic and were denied it. So as we linger in the warm glow of this remembered night, It is right to make room in the story for those the night left outside. Their absence from the gymnasium was not natural or inevitable. It was imposed, and it was wrong. And any honest telling of what prom was really like in 1950s, America has to hold space for them too. For the ones prom forgot, whose exclusion is as much a part of the era's truth as any corsage or crown. As the night wore on, a new enemy emerged, the curfew. Back in that living room, a firm time had been agreed upon, and everyone knew exactly what happened to teenagers who broke it. The clock on the gymnasium wall became your quiet nemesis, its hands creeping forward faster than seemed physically possible. Every slow dance, every cup of punch, every whispered conversation was shadowed by the knowledge that the evening carried an expiration date, and that date was enforced by parents who would absolutely be waiting up. So you savoured what time you had, one eye always drifting back toward the clock. Just when the evening had settled into its magic, just when the dancing and the romance and the whole shimmering fantasy had begun to feel like it might last forever, a new adversary crept quietly into the picture, the curfew. It had been there all along, of course, lurking in the background since the very start, but as the night wore on it grew steadily more insistent, more present, more impossible to ignore. Its origins traced back to that dreaded living room, to the interrogation you had survived at the beginning of the night. Somewhere in the midst of the small talk and the pointed questions, a time had been named and agreed upon, a firm hour by which the girl was to be returned home, delivered safely and punctually to her waiting family. It was not a suggestion. It was a deadline, spoken with the full weight of parental authority, and both of you understood exactly what it meant. And everyone knew, too, what befell the teenagers who dared to break it. A missed curfew was not a small thing, not a minor slip to be waved away with an apology. It carried real consequences, the kind that could poison future evenings, curtail future privileges, and unleash the particular fury of a parent who had sat up worrying past the appointed hour. The threat was well understood, and it lent the deadline a genuine and unavoidable power. So the clock on the gymnasium wall transformed over the course of the evening into your quiet nemesis. Where earlier you had barely noticed it, now you found your eyes drawn to it again and again, watching its hands with growing unease. And those hands seemed to move faster than any clock had a right to, creeping forward with a cruel and accelerating speed, devouring your precious remaining minutes while you tried desperately to hold on to the night. Every good thing about the evening now carried a shadow tinted by the awareness of time running out. Every slow dance was sweeter and sadder for being possibly one of the last. Every cup of punch, every whispered conversation, every small perfect moment came wrapped in the quiet knowledge that the whole enchanted evening had an expiration stamped upon it, a hard limit drawing inexorably closer with each turn of those merciless hands, and behind that limit stood the enforcers, the parents who would absolutely, without question, be waiting up. There was no bending the deadline, no hoping it might be forgotten, because you knew with total certainty that a light would be on at home, and a parent would be sitting beneath it, watching the door, noting the hour. The curfew was real precisely because its enforcement was guaranteed, and that guarantee robbed you of any comforting illusion that you might simply lose track of time. So you did the only thing you could do. You savoured. Knowing the end was coming, knowing you could not stop it, you threw yourself into what time remained, determined to wring every drop of magic from the dwindling minutes. You danced a little closer to the memory, laughed a little harder, held on to every moment with the particular intensity of someone who knows it is slipping away. And through it all, one eye kept drifting back toward the clock, toward that quiet nemesis on the wall, counting down the last of the most important night of your young life. When the final song faded and the lights came up, the night was not necessarily over. For many teenagers, the real fun began after prom, at the local diner or the drive-in. Still dressed in your finest, you piled into the car and headed for a booth, with vinyl seats and a jukebox humming in the corner, where you ordered burgers, fries and milkshakes and finally felt like you could breathe again, girdle permitting. The diner buzzed with other prom-goers reliving the evening, comparing notes, and laughing far too loudly. It was the sweet, greasy, wonderful come-down after hours of formality, and for many it was the best part of the whole night. The end of the dance was not, as it happened, the end of the night. When the final song faded away and the harsh gymnasium lights came up, dispelling the enchantment and revealing once more the basketball hoops and the crepe paper for what they were, the evening entered a new and in many ways better phase. For a great many teenagers, the formal dance was merely the opening act, and the real fun was only just beginning. The destinations were the beloved institutions of the era, the local diner and the drive-in, those glowing havens of casual teenage life. Still dressed in your very finest, your rented jacket and your marshmallow gown now slightly wilted from hours of dancing, you piled back into the borrowed car and set off toward the promise of food and freedom. There was a giddy energy to the drive, the sense of an evening's formality falling away and something looser and warmer taking its place. The diner welcomed you into its comfortable embrace, all vinyl booths and chrome trim, and a jukebox humming softly in the corner. You slid into a seat, the vinyl squeaking beneath you, and studied a menu you already knew by heart. And then you ordered the good stuff, the real food, the burgers and fries and thick creamy milkshakes that no formal dinner could ever match, comfort food to reward yourselves after the long campaign of the evening. And in that booth, over that greasy, wonderful food, you finally felt like you could breathe again, at least as much as the persistent girdle would allow. The whole evening had been a performance, a sustained effort of poise and manners and careful comportment, and now, at last, you could relax. You could slouch a little. You could laugh without checking who was watching. You could be, once more, an ordinary teenager rather than a stiff and formal version of yourself, and the relief of it was enormous. The diner itself buzzed with a wonderful energy, because you were far from alone. All around you sat other prom-goers, other couples and groups in their own rumpled finery, filling the booths and crowding the counter, all of them riding the same wave of post-prom exhilaration. The whole place hummed with the sound of the evening being relived in real time, story upon story, detail upon detail, the collective processing of a night that had meant so much. They compared notes, these fellow survivors, trading observations about the music and the crowning and who had danced with whom. They relived the highlights and the disasters alike, the triumphs and the small humiliations, all of it recounted with the breathless enthusiasm of people too excited to sit still. And they laughed, loudly, far too loudly, the unrestrained laughter of teenagers finally freed from the watchful eyes of chaperones, filling the diner with a joyful racket. It was in the end the sweet and greasy and thoroughly wonderful come-down from hours of enforced formality, and for many it was the finest part of the entire night. The dance had been magical, yes, but the dance had also been work, a careful and closely monitored performance. The diner was pure release, all comfort and laughter and milkshakes and friends, the real celebration that followed the official one. And years later, when you thought back on your prom, it might well be this you remembered most fondly, not the crepe paper stars, but the vinyl booth, the jukebox, and the sound of too loud laughter over a plate of cooling fries. And then, at last, came the ride home, an event loaded with more meaning than any teenager would ever admit out loud. Some couples took the scenic route, and here we arrive at the era's most whispered about tradition, parking. Finding a quiet spot to sit in a parked car and, well, talk was a rite of passage that fueled endless gossip and stern parental warnings. But the clock was merciless, the curfew was real, and eventually every car had to point itself toward home. You pulled into the driveway, walked your date to the door beneath the porch light, and mumbled a nervous good night, knowing full well that the entire school would hear about every last detail by Monday morning. At long last, the evening arrived at its final chapter, the ride home. It sounds like a simple matter of getting from one place to another, but for a teenager on prom night it was nothing of the sort. The ride home was loaded with significance, weighted with unspoken meaning and quiet possibility, an event that no teenager would ever openly admit meant as much as it did. It was the last stretch of a momentous night, and everyone treated it accordingly. Some couples, it must be said, took the scenic route home, and here we arrive at the era's most whispered about tradition of all, parking. This was the practice of finding a quiet, secluded spot, pulling the car over and sitting together in the dark to, well, talk. It was a rite of passage cloaked in mystery and rumour, the subject of endless speculation among peers and stern, pointed warnings from parents who knew exactly what parking tended to involve and wished it to involve considerably less. The whole business of parking fueled a great engine of gossip, spinning off stories and rumours that circulated endlessly through the school. Who had parked where, and with whom, and for how long, was the kind of information that travelled fast and grew in the telling. And the parents, well aware of the tradition and its reputation, issued their warnings in advance, laying down rules and expectations and making very clear the consequences of straying from the appointed path straight home. But looming over any detour, over any romantic notion of a scenic route, stood the merciless reality of the clock. The curfew was real, we have established this thoroughly, and it did not soften just because the night had been magical. Eventually, inevitably, every car had to abandon whatever quiet spot it had found and point itself firmly toward home, because the appointed hour was approaching, and the waiting parents would not be trifled with. Time, as always on this night, had the final word, and so you made your way back at last, pulling the borrowed car carefully into the driveway, mindful even now of your father's beloved machine and its precious unblemished finish. The great evening had wound down to its very last moments, and only the good night remained, that final small ceremony to close out the night. You climbed out, came around, and walked your date up to her front door, the two of you illuminated by the steady yellow glow of the porch light. The good night itself was a nervous, tender, awkward little affair, all the more so for taking place beneath that porch light, with the near certainty that a parent hovered somewhere just inside. You mumbled your thanks, and she mumbled hers, and there passed between you a moment heavy with everything the night had held, and everything neither of you quite knew how to say. Whatever happened in that moment, a shy word, a quick good night, was brief and freighted and utterly memorable, and through it all ran one final inescapable certainty, that every detail of this good night, this ride, this entire evening, would be thoroughly known throughout the school by Monday morning. There were no secrets among teenagers, no moment too small to be dissected and shared, and you knew as you turned to go that the whole night would soon be public knowledge, retold and analysed in the hallways for days to come. So the door closed, and you walked back to the car under the porch light, and the most important night of your young life was finally quietly over. It had cost you months of saving, and hours of preparation, and no small amount of terror. It had been governed by rules and watched by chaperones and shadowed by the clock. And it had been, despite all of that, or perhaps because of it, absolutely magical, a night you would carry with you long after the crepe paper came down, all the way into the version of you that would one day tell the story yourself, So there it is, one complete evening in 1958, survived from curlers to curfew. You woke up this morning with your head pinned into soup cans and your mother already weeping in the hallway, and somehow you made it all the way through. You endured the terror of the ask, the tyranny of the girdle, the interrogation in the living room, and the watchful eyes of a gymnasium full of chaperones counting the inches between you and your date. You saved for months and spent it all in a night. You danced at arm's length beneath a sky made of construction paper, guarded the punch bowl's honour, clapped politely for a king and queen who were not you, and drove your father's beloved car home without a single scratch, which may have been the greatest achievement of all. It is easy to look back on it now and laugh, and you should, because it was gently absurd. All that rubber armour and hairspray and careful choreography, all those rules handed down and followed without question. But underneath the crepe paper and the strict etiquette, there was something real. Young people getting dressed up in their very best, hearts pounding, hoping the night would mean everything, and for many of them it did. We should also remember quietly that the magic was never handed out equally. Behind the soft nostalgic glow were teenagers left standing outside the door, for no reason but the injustice of the time, and they deserved every bit of the wonder they were denied. So tonight, as you settle into your own soft bed, free to breathe deeply, free to wear whatever you please, free to text anyone you like without rehearsing it in a mirror for a week, maybe spare a gentle thought for those nervous kids in their rented jackets and marshmallow gowns. They swayed under paper stars, mumbled their good nights beneath a porch light and hoped, as we all still do, that someone out there might just say yes. Rest easy now. The music has faded, the lights are dimming, and the long ride home is finally over. Good night.